Hello dear students, welcome all of you to today's logic class. In the last class, I had already discussed about the special syllogistic rule of figure 1 and figure 2. Today we will discuss about the special syllogistic rule of figure 3 and figure 4. Here I want to remind you just one thing, that before going to discuss about or prove about the special syllogistic rule of figure 3 and figure 4, you just remember 3 important things. The first one is you have to remember the general syllogistic rules, 10 general syllogistic rules, 10ଟି ସାଧାରଣ ନିୟମାବଳୀ, ଏବଂ the second one is which proposition distributes which term, କେଉଁ ତର୍କ ବାକ୍ୟ କେଉଁ ପଦକୁ ବ୍ୟାପ୍ତ କରୁଛି, and third one is the figure of the syllogism. So, you just remember these 3 things so that it will be easy to prove the logical special syllogistic rule of different figures, because here we prove the special syllogistic rules through the help of the general syllogistic rules. So, now I just write down which propositions distribute which term. So, there are 4 different propositions according to quality and quantity, and A proposition, universal affirmative proposition, distributes the subject term. Universal negative E proposition distributes the both the subject and predicate, and I proposition, which is particular affirmative, distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate, and O proposition, which distributes only the predicate and not the subject. So, here we become clear that the universal propositions distribute the subject term, the common is subject. So, universal propositions distribute the subject term, and negative propositions E and I, they distribute E and O negative propositions, they distribute the predicate term. And in case of affirmative proposition, there is possibility of the distribution of subject term, because A proposition distributes subject, but I proposition distributes nothing. But in case of the particular proposition, that is I and O, there is the possibility of the distribution of predicate term, because I proposition distributes nothing and O proposition distributes predicate. So, you have to remember all these things, which term, which proposition distributes which term, so that we can prove the special syllogistic rules easily. Now, we will see what are the special syllogistic rule of figure 3. So, first we prove the special syllogistic rule of figure 3 one by one. So, in figure 3 there are 3 special syllogistic rules. Now, I read out what are the rules, then we will prove it and also determine the valid moods by the application of the 3 special syllogistic rules in figure 3. So, first rule is the minor premise must be affirmative. ओडिया रे आमे ताको कहूजे पक्षावयव सदर्थक हेबा आवश्यक, तृतीय संस्थान रे पक्षावयव सदर्थक हेबा आवश्यक. The second rule is the conclusion must be particular, सिद्धांत आंशिक हेबा आवश्यक. Third rule is at least one of the premises must be universal, अंततः गोटिए हेतुवाक्य सार्विक हेबा आवश्यक. So, these are the 3 different special rules of figure 3. Now, we will discuss what is the first rule and we have to prove it. So, the first rule is the minor premise must be affirmative. Now, you see what is the figure or diagram of third figure. So, the third figure, the diagram of figure 3 is like this. Here the middle term is present in the subject place in both the premises. दुईटी जाक तर्क वाक्य बा हेतु वाक्य मध्यपद उभयस्र उद्देश्य स्थान रे अवस्थित. And the first rule is the minor premise must be affirmative. The minor premise must be affirmative. Here in order to prove it, we let just its opposite. If the minor premise is not affirmative, आमे मने कर धरुचे जदि minor premise affirmative बा सदर्थक न हुए ताले what will be it? Then it will be negative. If the minor premise is not affirmative, then it will be negative. So here we suppose that the minor premise is negative. If the minor premise is negative, the major premise must be affirmative, because according to the rule number 5, both the premises cannot be negative, because from two negative premises no conclusion can be drawn. So if one of the premise is negative, then the other must be affirmative. So here according to the rule number 6, general rule 6, the major premise is affirmative, the minor premise is negative, and the conclusion is also negative. Because the rule number 6, general rule 6 states that if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So here the in minor premise, the negative proposition distributes the negative proposition the conclusion is negative, the major premise is affirmative. So here the in this conclusion negative proposition means either it can be E or it can be O, universal affirmative, universal negative and particular negative. In both cases we said that the negative propositions distributes its predicate. So in the conclusion there is the possibility or the predicate term which is otherwise known as the major term is distributed in the conclusion. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion, then it should be distributed in the major premise. Jodi major term conclusion रे व्याप्त हुए, then it should be distributed in the major premise. Otherwise we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure, because the rule general rule 4 states that no term can be distributed in the conclusion if it is not distributed in the premise. Jodi konosi term premise re distribute na hoichi, then it should not be distributed in the conclusion. So here we see that the negative conclusion distributes its predicate, so it should be distributed in the major premise. But the major premise is already proved that it is affirmative. So affirmative propositions are A and I, particular affirmative I, universal affirmative A. So A proposition distributes only subject and I proposition distributes nothing. So here in case of major premise, as it is an affirmative proposition, it does not distribute its predicate, but the major term is distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the major premise. So here we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. Therefore the supposition which we suppose that the minor premise must be negative, that is proved to be wrong. So the minor premise cannot be negative, rather it must be affirmative. ताले negative हेई परिबा नै, नंजर्थक हेई परिबा नै, या सदर्थक हबो. This is the first rule of figure 3, special syllogistic rule of figure 3. Now just see what is explained in the slide. Now we prove the special syllogistic rule 2 of figure 3. Figure 3 रो तृतीय संस्थान रो आमे द्वितीय स्वतंत्र नियमावली कौन हबो सेटा देखिबा, and we also prove it, याकु मध्यम प्रमाण करिबा. The second special syllogistic rule of figure 3 is the conclusion must be particular. सिद्धांत निश्चित भाबरे आंशिक हेबा आवश्यक. In the diagram the middle term is situated or placed in the subject place in both the premises. So, the conclusion must be particular. If the conclusion is not particular, then let it be universal. जदि सिद्धांत आंशिक न हुए तेबे यह सार्विक हब universal. If the conclusion is universal, then the minor term is distributed. जदि सिद्धांत यूनिवर्सल प्रोपोजिशन बा सार्विक हुए तो सार्विक बा यूनिवर्सल प्रोपोजिशंस आर आइदर द यूनिवर्सल अफर्मेटिव दैट इज ए प्रोपोजिशन or it may be universal negative that is E proposition, and in both cases the common is the subject term must be distributed. उद्देश्य पद को उभय यूनिवर्सल प्रोपोजिशन डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करती बा व्याप्त करती. सो हियर इफ द कंक्लूजन इज ए universal proposition, then the subject of the conclusion will be distributed, and the subject of the conclusion is otherwise known as the minor term. Here if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, सिद्धांतरे minor term बा पक्ष पद एठी व्याप्त होइछि. So it must be distributed in the minor premise, because the rule number 4 states that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, that should be, if a term is distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the premise, then we will commit the fallacy, either the fallacy of illicit major or the fallacy of illicit minor. अवैध साध्यता दोष बा अवैध पक्षता दोष आमे सृष्टि हब. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the major premise, we will commit the fallacy of illicit major. If the minor term is distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the minor premise, then we will commit the fallacy of illicit minor. So here in the universal conclusion, the subject term is distributed, and that is otherwise known as minor term. So the minor term should be distributed in the minor premise, but the minor premise, the minor term in the minor premise is in the predicate place. So in order to distribute the minor term in the minor premise, it must be a negative proposition. So in the third figure, the minor term is present in the subject place in the conclusion, and the minor term is present in the minor premise in the predicate place, and in here the minor term is distributed here. So we want to distribute it in the minor premise in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit minor. So as only negative propositions distribute their predicate, so in order to distribute the minor term, we take the minor premise as a negative proposition, because only negative proposition distribute their predicate. So here the minor premise becomes a negative proposition, but rule number 5 states that both the premises cannot be negative. So as the minor premise is a negative proposition, the major premise must be affirmative. एटा नंजर्थक हेले पक्षावयव नंजर्थक हेले साध्यावयव affirmative बा सदर्थक हेबो. तो here the major premise is affirmative, the minor premise is negative, and rule number 6, general rule 6 states that if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So here we get the negative conclusion. The negative conclusion distributes its predicate term, and the predicate of the conclusion is otherwise known as the major term. So here the predicate term is distributed, so the predicate of the conclusion is major term. So in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit major, the major term should be distributed in the major premise, so that we can avoid the fallacy of illicit major. But it is already proved that आमे आगुरु प्रमाण करि सारिछे जे the major premise which is affirmative, because both the premises cannot be negative, one is negative, the another is proved to be affirmative. So एठी आमे सदर्थक बोली already आमे प्रूव करि सारिछे. as the major premise is an affirmative proposition कहले आमे बुझुचे A or I, universal affirmative or particular affirmative. But in both cases it is possibility अछि जे subject term distribute होबार, because A proposition distributes subject and I proposition distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate. So as the major premise is an affirmative proposition, here the predicate term remains undistributed. So here the negative conclusion distributes major term, but the major term is not distributed in the major premise. So it leads to the fallacy of illicit major. ताले जदि आमे एठी affirmative करूछे एठी major premise बा साध्यावयव आर विधेय पद को व्याप्त करूनी, सो आमे अवैध साध्यता दोष एठी सृष्टि होबो, fallacy of illicit major. So whatever we assumed the conclusion is not particular, rather it will be universal, then it will lead to the fallacy of illicit major. So the conclusion cannot be a universal proposition, rather it must be a particular proposition. So this is the second special syllogistic rule of figure 3, which we prove. Then comes the third special syllogistic rule of figure 3. तृतीय संस्थानर तृतीय स्वतंत्र नियम ताले the third one is at least one of the premises must be universal. अंततः गोटे मात्र हेतुवाक्य सार्विक हेबा आवश्यक. दुईटी हेतुवाक्यरु प्रथमटी प्रधान हेतुवाक्य, द्वितीयटी अप्रधान हेतुवाक्य, मेजर प्रेमिस एंड माइनर प्रेमिस. ए दुईटी हेतुवाक्य मध्यरु जे कोनोसी गोटे हेतुवाक्य निश्चित भाबरे सार्विक हबा आवश्यक. बोथ कैन नॉट बी पर्टिकुलर. So here we will prove it. So you just see the diagram of figure 3. So the third rule states that at least one of the premises must be universal. So here there are two premises, major and minor. Suppose we let it be that at least one of the premises is not universal, so that we suppose that both the premises are particular. One cannot be universal, rather both the premises are particular. दुईटी जाक हेतुवाक्य एठी आंशिक हबो. मने कर जदि दुईटी जाक हेतुवाक्य आंशिक हुए, सार्विक न हुए गोटिए भी, ताहले what will happen? So here first we prove, then there is also the general syllogistic rule 8, that from two particular propositions no conclusion follows. दीटा जाक जदि पर्टिकुलर बा आंशिक तर्क वाक्य हुए हेतुवचन दुईटी, then no conclusion can be followed. This is the 8 general syllogistic rule. But suppose we assume that both the premises are particular. If both the premises are particular कहिले आमे बुझुचे either I or O proposition. I particular affirmative and O is particular negative. If both the premises are particular, then here there is the possibility of the distribution of predicate term. दीटा जाकरे predicate term distribute होर संभावना अछि. But here the middle term, the मध्यम पद दुईटी जाक हेतु वाक्य रे उद्देश्य स्थान रे अवस्थित. Middle term is placed in the subject place in both the premises. दुईटी जाक हेतु वाक्य रे subject जगह रे अछि. But particular propositions distribute only predicate. There is the possibility of distribution of predicate term. So here in both cases the middle term remains undistributed. दुईटी जाक क्षेत्र रे दुईटी जाक हेतु वाक्य रे मध्यम पद बा हेतु पद अव्याप्त रहिबो. According to the general rule 3, तृतीय साधारण नियमावली अनुसार at least the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. जे कोनोसी हेतु वाक्य रे थरे सर्वत्र व्याप्त हवा आवश्यक. But here in both the premises the middle term remain undistributed. So, we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle or अव्याप्त हेतु पद दोष एठी सृष्टि हब. So, if both the premises are particular then no conclusion can be drawn in figure 3. ताले फिगर 3 बा तृतीय संस्थान रे जदि दुईटी जाक हेतु वाक्य आंशिक हुए तेबे कोनोसी सिद्धांत निश्चित हेउ नाही. Therefore, whatever we assume that both the premises are particular is proved to be wrong. So, at least one of the premises must be universal, both cannot be particular. Now, these are the three special syllogistic rules of figure 3. तर तीनोटी जाक एई तीनोटी जाक होची तृतीय संस्थार तीनोटी स्वतंत्र नियमावली. Now we apply these three. Just see what is in the slide. So now we apply the three special syllogistic rules in order to determine the valid modes of figure 3. तृतीय संस्थान रे आमे एई तीनोटी जाक स्वतंत्र नियमावली रो व्यवहार करी वैध न्याय रूप कौन हबो आमे सेउडा का देखिबा. So now we apply the out of these three special syllogistic rules, if we apply the special syllogistic rule 1, that is the minor premise must be affirmative. So if the minor premise must be affirmative, out of the 6-10 possible combinations, 8 are rejected according to the general syllogistic rules. Now we have 8 possible combinations and we see in third figure from the 8 possible combinations which are proved to be valid modes. So we have here I have also mentioned AA, AE, AI, AO, EI, EA, IA and OA. So out of these 8 possible combinations, we will see which are valid according to the 3 special syllogistic rules of figure 3. So if we apply the first special rule, then that is the minor premise must be affirmative. So here we find that the minor premise must be affirmative. In these two cases, the minor premise is negative. Here universal negative and here particular negative. So these two are rejected according to the first special syllogistic rule of figure 3. AE and AO cannot be a valid mode in case of figure 3 because the minor premise is here is not affirmative, rather it is negative. So the rest 6 AA, AE, EI, EA, IA and OA are the valid modes in figure 3. The first AA, that is Darapti, AI Dattisi, EA Felapton, EI Ferison, IA that is Bisamis and OA that is Bocado. So these are the 6 valid modes in figure 3 according to the 3 special syllogistic rules. Now we will prove the special syllogistic rules of figure 4. एबे आमे चतुर्थ संस्थानर समस्त स्वतंत्र नियमावली को प्रमाण करिबा एवं वैध न्याय रूप निरूपण करिबा and also determine the valid modes of fourth figure by the application of the special syllogistic rule of figure 4. So now I just read out what are the special syllogistic rule of figure 4. Then we will prove it and also apply it in order to determine the valid modes. So the first rule is the first special rule of figure 4 is, if the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise must be universal. साध्यावयव सदर्थक हेले पक्षावयव सार्विक हुए. The second rule is, if one of the premises is negative, then the major premise must be universal. कौनसी एक हेतुवाक्य जदि नंजर्थक हुए तेबे साध्यावयव सार्विक होबो. And the third special rule is, if the minor premise is affirmative, then the conclusion must be particular. पक्षावयव जदि सदर्थक हुए तेबे सिद्धांत आंशिक हेबो. These are the three special syllogistic rule of fourth figure. Now we will prove one by one. The first special syllogistic rule of figure 4 is, if the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise must be universal. Now figure 4, the diagram is like this: middle term, major term, in the fourth figure the position of middle term is in the predicate place in major premise, and the position of middle term is in the subject place in the minor premise. प्रधान हेतुवाक्य बा साध्यावयवरे मध्यम पद विधेय स्थान रे अछि एवं पक्षावयवरे बा अप्रधान हेतुवाक्य रे मध्यम पद सब्जेक्ट बा उद्देश्य स्थान रे अछि. So here we will prove the first special syllogistic rule. If the major premise is affirmative, जदि major premise affirmative हुए, then the minor premise must be universal. Minor premise universal habo. We will prove it. If the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise is universal. So just see, if the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise must be universal. In fourth figure, if the major premise is affirmative, the middle term, then here in the major premise, the position of middle term is in the predicate place. If it is an affirmative proposition, जदि एटा गोटे affirmative बा सदर्थक तर्कवाक्य हुए, either it will be A or I proposition, universal affirmative or particular affirmative. If it is an affirmative proposition, then there is no possibility of distribution of the predicate term. ताले एठी जदि सदर्थक तर्कवाक्य हुए प्रधान हेतुवाक्य, ताहाले एठी विधेय पद व्याप्त होबार कोनोसी संभावना नाही, because A proposition distributes only subject and I proposition distribute neither the subject nor the predicate. So here the middle term remains undistributed. According to the general rule 3, the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. But here in the major premise, the middle term remains undistributed. So we must want to distribute the middle term in the minor premise, and in the minor premise the middle term is situated or placed in the subject place. ताले minor बा अप्रधान हेतुवाक्य बा पक्षावयवरे मध्यम पद उद्देश्य स्थान रे अछि. So you must see which proposition distribute its subject term ताले को तर्क वाक्य तार subject बा उद्देश्य को व्याप्त करे ताले here we know that the universal propositions either universal affirmative or universal negative, that is A or E proposition distributes its subject. So, if the major premise is affirmative and the middle term is not distributed in the major premise, in order to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle, the minor premise must be a universal proposition, because if it is not universal, then the subject term cannot be distributed and we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, in order to distribute the middle term, we must take it as a universal proposition or sarvika tarka vakya. So, it is proved that if the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise must be universal. So, this is the first rule. Prathama Swatantra Niyamavali Chaturtha Sansthanara. So, now the second rule. The second rule is if either premises, that means if one of the premises is negative, then the major premise must be universal. Either of the premise is negative, then the either of the premise is negative means one of the premises. That means either the major premise is a negative proposition or the minor premise is a negative proposition. Suppose we take the major premise is a negative proposition. If the major premise is a negative proposition, then the minor premise must be an affirmative proposition. So, if the major premise is a negative proposition, what will happen? Now, as per the general rule 6, if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So, if the major premise is a negative proposition, then the conclusion is negative. If the conclusion is a negative proposition, because both the premises cannot be negative, so one of the premise is negative and another premise is affirmative. And here, if the conclusion is negative, the negative conclusion distributes. If the major premise is negative and minor premise is affirmative, then the conclusion must be a negative proposition according to the rule number 6. A negative conclusion distributes its predicate, and the predicate of the conclusion is otherwise known as the major term. ताले सिद्धांतर predicate बा विधेय पद को आमे साध्य पद भावे जानू. तो as per the general rule 4, the major term must be distributed in the major premise in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit measure. ताले fallacy of illicit measure को avoid करिया कहले कौन करिबा ना major term और जोटा को आमे साध्य पद कहूचे ता साध्य भाव निश्चित भाव व्याप्त हेबा आवश्यक. In the major premise, the subject, the major term is situated or placed in the subject place. So, as the major term is situated in the subject place, in order to distribute the major term in the major premise, that must be a universal proposition, because only universal propositions distribute their subject term. केवल सार्विक तर्क वाक्य तार उद्देश्य पद को व्याप्त करे. So, the major premise must be universal. Here it is proved, if the major premise is a negative proposition, then it must be a universal proposition. Now, we take if the minor premise is a negative proposition, then what will be? If the minor premise is a negative proposition, the major premise must be affirmative and the conclusion must be negative. ताले जदि आमे major premise को minor premise को suppose negative नेले, major premise must be affirmative according to the rule number 5, and if the negative minor premise is negative and the major premise is affirmative, then the conclusion will also be negative, because if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So, here the negative conclusion distributes its predicate. Predicate is otherwise known as the major term. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it should be distributed in the major premise, because if it is not distributed in the major premise, then we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. So, no term can be distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the premises. So, here in order to distribute the major term in the major premise, we take it as a universal proposition, because only universal proposition distribute its subject, and the predicate of the conclusion, that is major term, is situated in the subject place. So, here if the minor premise is a negative proposition, the major premise is proved to be a universal proposition. So, this is the second rule of fourth figure. Now, if the third rule is, if the minor premise is affirmative, then the conclusion must be a particular proposition. Jodi minor premise अप्रधान हेतु वाक्य बा पक्षावयव जदि सदर्थक हुए, तेबे सिद्धांत कौन हबो ना आंशिक हबो. So, if the minor premise is affirmative, then the minor term remains undistributed. जदि आमे minor premise को बा पक्षावयव को सदर्थक नेउछे, सदर्थक कहले either universal affirmative or particular affirmative. If the minor premise is an affirmative proposition, either A habo kimba A habo. If the minor premise is an affirmative proposition, then the predicate term, that is the minor term, is undistributed in the minor premise. ताले आमे जदि याकु सदर्थक नबा ताले एठी minor term जहाँ को आमे कहूचे पक्षपद, that is undistributed. If the minor term is undistributed in the minor premise, it should not be distributed in the conclusion, because here if the according to the rule number, general rule number 4, no term can be distributed in the conclusion if it is not distributed in the premises. Here the minor term is not distributed in the minor premise. So, we try that it should not be distributed in the conclusion. If or in order to make it undistributed in the conclusion, रे आमे याको अव्याप्त करिवा पई, we should take the conclusion as a particular proposition, because the particular proposition, that is I or O. Particular propositions, particular affirmative or particular negative, they distribute their predicate. Predicate term distribute karanti, subject term distribute karantini. So, if the conclusion will be a particular proposition, then the minor term remains undistributed and we can avoid the fallacy of illicit minor. So, the fourth rule, sorry, the third rule, that is, if the minor premise is affirmative, then the conclusion must be particular. So, now it is proved. Now, we apply the three special syllogistic rules of figure 4 in order to test the validity of the argument. So, what are the valid moods in fourth figure? If we apply the three special syllogistic rules of figure 4. Now, we see what are the valid moods in fourth figure. By the application of these three special syllogistic rule of figure 4. So, what are the possible combinations? The 8 possible combinations are AA, AE, AI, AO and EA, E, I, A and O, A. These are the 8 possible combinations, and we apply the rule 1. What is the rule 1? Now, if the major premise is affirmative, then the minor premise must be universal. If the major premise is affirmative, minor premise must be universal. So, here AI and AO are rejected because here the major premise is affirmative, but the minor premise is not universal. This is particular and this is also particular. So, these two are rejected according to the rule 1. The second special rule is if either of the premises is negative, then the major premise must be universal. So, here OA combination is also rejected. Here one of the premise is negative O, but the major premise is not universal, it is particular negative. So, this is also rejected. So, we have these 5 possible combinations from which we get valid moods in 4th figure, and the 5 valid moods of 4th figure is AA. From AA we get I, that is Brahmantive, AEE, that is Kamenes, EAO, that is Fesapo, EIO, Freshison, and IAI, that is Demaris. So, these are the valid moods in 4th figure. So, now let us see in these 4 figures we find that there are fundamental moods or fundamental syllogism, strengthened syllogism and weakened syllogism. So, what is fundamental syllogism? Out of these 19 valid moods. So, in these 4 figures there are 19 valid moods, and out of these 19 valid moods, 15 valid moods are fundamental, 4 valid moods are strengthened, and or those are called also non-fundamental syllogism, and 5 are weakened syllogism. So, first one is fundamental. What is fundamental syllogism or fundamental modes? A fundamental syllogism is that in which no term is unnecessarily distributed in the premises. According to the general rule, we know that the middle term must be distributed at least once. That means, here in case of a fundamental syllogism, the middle term must be distributed only once, not twice. दुई थर व्याप्त न होइकि थरे व्याप्त होइतिबो, and the major premise is not distributed in the premises without being distributed in the premises without being distributed in the conclusion. ताले एठी major term conclusion रे distribute न होइकि केवल तर्क वाक्य बा हेतु वाक्य रे distribute हो नथिबो. Here all the valid moods of figure 1 and figure 2 are fundamental syllogism, and in figure 3 Dattisi, Disamis, Boccado, Ferison are valid moods which are called fundamental. In 4th figure Kamenes, Demaris and Freshison are also fundamental syllogism. So, there are 15 fundamental syllogism. Then strengthened syllogism. What is a strengthened syllogism? If in a syllogism one of the premises is unnecessarily stronger than what is required for the conclusion, that is called strengthened syllogism. That means, suppose in case of a strengthened syllogism like Darapti, Phelapton, Brahmantive and Phesapo. Here in case of Darapti, in place of IA proposition, if we take I, then the same conclusion is also drawn. In case of Phelapton, in case of E, if we take I as one of the premise, then it will also give us the same conclusion. So, here the major premise is unnecessarily stronger than what is required. Now, व्हाट इज वीकेंड सिलोजिज्म और वीकेंड को आम कहूचे दुर्बलीकृत न्याय रूप, स्ट्रेंथेंड अति बल न्याय रूप और फंडामेंटल को आम मौलिक न्याय बोली कहूचे। ताले वीकेंड सिलोजिज्म, ए वीकेंड सिलोजिज्म इज दैट इन व्हिच ए पर्टिकुलर कंक्लूजन इज ड्रॉन although a universal conclusion is justified by the premises, that is called a weakened syllogism. Here the conclusion is weaker than what is justified by the premises. So now these are the valid moods in 4 different figures by the application of the special syllogistic rule of third and fourth figure. Now we just see 8 moods that are valid in one or more than one figures. A is valid in figure 1, 3 and 4. From A combination we get Barbara in first, Darati in second, Bramantive in fourth figure. From A E combination we get Kamestress and Kamenes. A I combination we get Dari and Datisi. From E A combination we get in all figures E A रे आमे देखुचे Celarent, Cesare, Philapton and Fesapo. E I combination we get Dari, Ferio, Ferison and Frecision. One more rules which is possible in case of figure 4. So figure 4, that is this is the figure of figure 4. Here it is said that O proposition cannot be a premise in case of fourth figure. ताले O proposition चतुर्थ संस्थान रे गोटे तर्क वाक्य बा हेतु वाक्य हेई परिबा नाही. Now we see how O proposition cannot be a premise in the fourth figure. Suppose we take the major premise as O proposition. O is particular and negative. If the major premise is O proposition, then the minor premise must be A. Why? Because both the premises cannot be particular, because from 2 particular premises no conclusion can be drawn, and both the premises cannot be negative, because from 2 negative premises we cannot draw the conclusion according to the general rule 5. So if the major premise is O proposition, then the minor premise must be A and the conclusion must be O, because this is particular and negative. So the conclusion must be particular and negative. If the conclusion is O proposition, then the major term is distributed here, because the O proposition distributes its predicate. So the predicate of the conclusion is otherwise known as the major term. So here the major term is distributed in the conclusion. So it should be distributed in the major premise, because the rule number 4 states that no term can be distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the premises. So here in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit measure, the major term should be distributed in the major premise, but we take the major premise as O proposition. So O proposition distributes only predicate, not the subject. So here the major term is not distributed in the subject place as it is the subject of O proposition. So we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. Again, if we take the minor premise as O proposition, ताले आमे मेजर प्रेमिस को ओ नहीं कि देखले जे एटा रही परिबनी फालासी ऑफ इलिसिट मेजर अराइज करिवो. If we take the minor premise as O proposition, then the conclusion will also be O. ताले here A O combination we get the conclusion O. If it is O proposition, then it will distribute its predicate, but A proposition it distributes its subject and O proposition distributes its predicate. You see the middle term is situated in the predicate place in the major premise and it is situated in the subject place in the minor premise. As it is A proposition, it does not distribute its predicate, it distributes only its subject, as it is the O proposition, it distributes its predicate, but not the subject. So, in both the premises, the middle term remains undistributed. So, according to the general rule 3, if the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. If it is not distributed at least once, then we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, here the fallacy of undistributed middle बा अव्याप्त हेतु पददोष सृष्टि होची जदि आमे माइनर प्रेमिस को ओ तर्क वाक्य भाबे नउचे. So, in both cases O proposition cannot be a premise in fourth figure. So, it is proved that O proposition cannot be. So, now we will see 8 moods that are valid in one or more than one figures. So, from A we see that A is a valid mood in figure 1, 3 and 4. From A we get Barbara in 1, Darapti in 3 and Brahmatip in 4. From AE combination or A is valid in figure 2 and 4. AE we get Kamestres in second and Kamenes in 4. AI combination we get Dari in first and Datisi in third. EA combination is possible in all figures Celarent, Cesare, Philapton, Fesapo. EI combination we get also valid modes in all the 4 figures Dari, Ferio, Ferison and Frecision, and AO is valid in figure 2 that is Barocco, OA is valid in figure 3 that is Boccado, IA is valid in figure 3 and 4, IA ru ame pauche Dimaris in 4th figure and Disamis in 3rd figure. So, these are the special syllogistic rule of 3rd and 4th figure, and by the application of these these special syllogistic rules we determine the valid moods of 3rd and 4th figure. So, thank you.